thank you very much indeed. So, very kind of you. I think we've caused a muddle because we came up in an entirely different order. So I'm going to introduce my guests all over again, and you can clap for them and give them some love because they deserve it. Because what you have over here is a stage that is groaning with biographical genius. These are the best biographers in the world at the moment. I dare you to argue with me. I dare you. So first of all, please welcome Ben Moser, Tina Brown, Robert Service, Janaki Bakhle, and Narayani Basu. Now we've got the energy up a bit. Isn't this great? So can I just tell you, we have got people who have written about the makers of nations, the breakers of nations, people who are responsible for constitutions that have built up great democracies and for those who have flown in the face of democracy and have revelled in tyranny. We have those who rub shoulders with royalty, and we have a Pulitzer Prize up here. So what I wanted to do was, instead of getting sort of deep down into the books, which you ought to bloody well go and buy, because they're all very, very good, is we'll talk about some of the themes of writing a biography. There's a brilliant quote by Oscar Wilde, which was, I just wanted to share it with you because it tickles me to the bone marrow. It says, "Biography lends to death a new terror," which is just so brilliant, because you may do whatever you want in life, but if a biographer gets hold of you and decides to present a face of you, that is what generations are going to know. They're not going to hear your voice. They're going to know you through the prism of these people sitting up here. So I just wanted to, first of all, and we'll start with you, Ben. Let's go along the bus stop, shall we? Do you feel that as a weight of responsibility?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You know very much. I think we've all seen in the era of fake news and of disinformation that, in fact, no matter how preposterous something is that you might read, and you might know this is obviously fake, if people see something in a book, if people see something on the internet, they will believe it. Not everybody, but actually quite a lot of us, and I'm saying in the first person plural, we are all susceptible to this far more than we think we are. And so as a biographer, as a historian, I think as a photographer, which is something I've also written about in connection with Susan Sontag and Annie Leibovitz, you have someone's life in your hands. And it's quite terrifying to think how easily a comma, a word, a stupid story from your bitchy neighbor can actually inform how generations are going to think about you. And so I think it's a very weighty responsibility, absolutely.
Yeah, but I mean, you don't always have to like the person. Do you feel the responsibility, even if maybe you don't warm to the person?
I do feel the responsibility. I'm also very struck by things that get into people's life legends, which are just not true. And you have to be so careful not to find yourself repeating them and to really treat everybody you write about, essentially, as the first time they've been written about and go back over it, because you'll find you're stunned at how much inaccuracy there is or mistelling of a story that we've all assumed was true. You know, I mean, an instance of that was Meghan Markle's father. In everything that's been written about Meghan Markle and her father, it talks about how during her childhood, when she was about 13, he won the lottery and I think won about $500,000. And I remember, you know, every pieces came up and I asked him, I said, you know, what did you do with that lottery money? I mean, it was just so much. He just said, what lottery money? I never won the lottery. I don't know where that came from. It appeared, and you know, it's been ever. I said, why didn't you correct it? He said, what's the point? I mean, it's just becomes something that people write about me that I won the lottery, and you think it's incredible, really, that should be so.
Well, I mean, it's also, can I say, it's a real danger in news where you have decreasing newsrooms and more rip and read, where people are relying on cuttings of that which has gone before. Bob, you are like the daddy when it comes to biographies, if you don't mind, the daddy on stage. You have to be the granddad in the microphone.
Quite happy to be a granddad.
So, but when it comes to starting a project, Anna, you have written about some of the most controversial people. Do you come saying, look, I owe you, Stalin. I owe you a debt. I'm going to spend 4 years of my life with you, and I owe you to get to the truth.
I don't think that at all. I don't think anybody owes Stalin a bean. I think he did everything in his life because he was terrified that people writing about him afterwards, as Oscar Wilde implies, would be hostile to him. So he covered up everything that he possibly could. Trotsky, on the other hand, kept everything. He even kept bus tickets and rail tickets. He kept all of his marginal notes in his first drafts. They tell you almost as much about him and his way of life and his way of thinking as do the big performances. So I don't think one has to feel that one owes it to the person. One owes it to the people who, in the case of Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, were brutalized. And so the opening up of the box, by whichever manner or means you can do it, and letting the truth come out, that's the responsibility.
Well, you've just also nuanced my question and made it much better. So I'm going to do the improved version now for the last two panelists.
Go on, have a go.
No, so I'll try. But when you write about Savarkar, do you write about someone that you think wanted to be remembered and immortalized, or in the case of someone like Stalin who didn't, was too busy doing the do rather than thinking about his name in the future?
That's a really great question.
Well, it's not for you. You have to wait.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Sorry.
You're welcome to answer it.
Yeah. No, we'll come back to you, Robert. That's enough for now. Come on, Janaki. Over to you.
So, in my case, Savarkar was very, very assiduous in ensuring that he would be remembered exactly as he wished it. So the process of commemoration begins in his own lifetime, arguably even by him. So I had to do something completely different, which was I had to look at all of the ways in which he orchestrated his own commemoration and then try and peel away to get to something that was related to his commemoration by himself, but not entirely yet.
Okay, that's interesting. And Narayani, the person that you've written about, again, I mean, he's so easy to conflate with another Menon that people have talked about, Krishna Menon, who I've been slightly obsessed about for a few years because of his position in London. But you've written about VP Menon, who is a civil servant and one of the architects of India. But by virtue of being a civil servant, did he want to disappear in the background and you've kind of forced him out against his will when you've written a biography?
I think by virtue of being a civil servant, you automatically do disappear into the background, which is why my task was cut out for me, because he was also working in the first half of the 20th century, which is when our independence movement was really taking off. And he had to work alongside names that are household names for modern India. So Nehru, Patel, Gandhi. How do you bring a civil servant out of their shadows, make him stand independently, as it were, pun intended, and give him his due? So in that sense, the responsibility for me was to sort of shine a light on somebody who was a massive player behind the scenes of independence. I think we tend to forget that behind the scenes of every huge movement like this, there are people who are actually cogs in the machine, who are actually like pulling a huge movement together and piecing it together and holding it together. Civil servant does precisely that and gets overlooked for the same reasons.
Right. I want to sort of throw something to you, Ben, that you've said, and I was intrigued by this sentence. So Benjamin's written this amazing book about Sontag, Susan Sontag, a thinker, photographer. I mean, so many things. She was so many things and summed up as sort of a generation of resistance, if you like. And you said, look, I was the authorized biographer, but I didn't write the authorized biography. What the hell does that mean? Okay.
Well, this is very important. I'm glad you asked, because it was the authorized biography. Absolutely not, because that implies a sort of censorship that implies that somebody went over it and said you can say this and you can't say that. That was not the case. I was asked, based on my previous biography of Clarice Lispector, to take on this project, and I was given the authorization, first of all, to speak to everyone, which was very hard because there was a divorce at the end of her life between her partner, Annie Leibovitz, and her son, and they hated each other and they divided into camps. And so having authorization to go into her papers, into her archives, which are still, it's like the Vatican. It's all secret. It's all locked up at the library. I could go into that, but my agreement, it took me a year to negotiate that agreement so that they could, I said the estate could read it and they could comment on it, but that I was not obliged to make any changes. And so it gave me a sort of opening and a sort of access, but unfortunately when people see anything authorization, they think they imply censorship. And it was kind of hard to talk about for that reason, because they thought it was a whitewash, which it wasn't. You know, I'm quite critical of her, although I try to be not critical of everything about her, but of certain things, mainly philosophical things.
Okay. I don't know anyone who has to tread a more slippery tightrope when it comes to access than someone writing about the royal family, the British royal family, who are notorious for calling themselves the firm. They close ranks. I mean, talk about portcullises and guns on the parapets. They are notorious for this and telling people not to talk. And yet you have written not one, but 2, 3 very successful books about the royal family. How did you get people to talk to you?
It's a very long, tiresome process, and what you have to do is be willing to make huge efforts to get very little, right? I actually found the really older generation, the sort of the Queen's generation, Queen Elizabeth's generation, actually the best sources in a funny way. They'd maybe reached a point when they didn't care as much, or they were just a more kind of honest generation, or there was no spin about them. I got some of my best stuff from very, very good friends of the Queen who'd known her for a very long time and just observed things very well. And you also discover that sometimes people who've been very close to your protagonists are just, you think, that's great. I've found somebody who was with a major royal during a major event, and they're going to have the absolute eyewitness thing. But they're not someone who has any eye for observation. You know, I mean, you discover that people can just be dull. You know, they were there, they were watching history pass before them, and they were sort of thinking about what they were going to be having for lunch, you know. And that's sometimes just crushingly disappointing. You think, this is going to be the source, you know. And sometimes I found people who sort of could form a background so they didn't notice they were around, as it were, very good sources. You know, intimate staff, decorators, you know, photographers who'd done a sitting, painters, things like that. They often had very good observations to share as well, actually.
Have you ever had somebody who says to you, I'm going to tell you this thing, but you cannot use it?
Oh, yes, constantly.
So what do you do?
It's maddening. It's infuriating. You know, you sort of hope they're going to die before the book comes out and then just sell them up the river. I had one of those with... actually with the Queen Mother's valet, you know, Billy Talon, his name was. I really stalked him to get him to talk to me, and then he gave me this fabulous interview in the end. I mean, I went to this house in, you know, sort of crummy little apartment at the top of a building in Kennington, where, I mean, you find that the courtiers in the end are treated so badly. I mean, they you know, they worship the royal family, and then when it's all over, they're just kicked off and living in penury, you know, in either a basement or one of those apartments where the light goes off on landing 3, you know, and he just gave me so much great stuff, and I couldn't, you know, how could I use it? He said it was all off the record. Blissfully, he died.
Oh, thank God.
About 2 months before I published. And so I got some of my best anecdotes from Billy Talon, I'm afraid. Sorry, Billy, but it was great stuff.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, for you, I'm thinking the challenge isn't people who tell you, here, I've got this really good one about Stalin and his shopping, but more about getting to the sources which are in a hostile place. So how did you get access?
It was possible in the early 90s. It was less possible, but still possible, in the late 1990s. It got steadily worse, and then very, very much worse now under Putin. So you know that you're only getting the dribs and drabs of the whole story. And the only way around this is to search for sources that don't have anything to do with each other. And often people write in exactly the same way about, say, Lenin. They have a sort of style of writing about Lenin that's imprinted on them, whether they're for or against him. So the only thing you can do then is to get as near as possible to the personal messages that the object of the biography came up with, and that's the correspondence. And that's why I talk about the importance of marginal notes. If you get, say, Trotsky's autobiography, Trotsky was a master of Russian prose, one of the great 20th century Russian writers. He was also the man who ordered the killing of the Kronstadt mutineers, who had helped his party come to power 4 years before. His autobiography flattens all the bad things he did that he felt ashamed of. You have to go into his correspondence, the correspondence of his followers, the ex-followers who had heard things and written to him. You have to use every single weapon you have to take the top off the box that he's trying to construct to conceal his own inner life. And Trotsky got up to all sorts of things apart from politics. He was fascinated with literature. He had a very, very active love life. He was devoted to his children, but not to the point that he paid much attention to them when they got into psychological difficulties. The task of writing a biography is that you have to look at everything, and people are often more self-revealing when you can see what they've written in the margins of their first drafts, what they fiddle around with and then cut out or put in. That often tells you more than a great speech will ever tell you. That's what I found fascinating and, well, frankly, alienating at the same time.
Right. So, I mean, that's not good news for biographers of the future, basically, unless, someone saves track changes. They're never going to see any of those things, those handwrites, those pauses, even letters. I mean, we'll come back to that maybe in a moment. You wrote about, Janaki, somebody who is mythologized in India now, is the father of Hindutva, is often referred to by Modi as sort of one of the founding father of the nation, to the point where it sort of eclipses Gandhi, or at some point there was an attempt to replace Gandhi, but now the two are sort of existing side by side, two men who could not have been more different. When it came to accessing any kind of source material on Savarkar, did you find that you had to pass some kind of purity test by the gatekeepers who said, what's your intention? What do you want to do? And then only we'll talk to you and show you the papers?
No, I didn't have to pass a purity test. The thing with Savarkar is that when I began the project, I didn't actually begin with the intention of writing a biography. I began the project because I had 3 historical questions. One of them was, how was it that in a relatively short period, 50 years is not a long time historically, that one vision of the nation had been eclipsed by another. And the vision of the nation that had taken over in 1947-48, well into the 60s, was on the back burner, it was on the margins. So how had it come back into sort of roaring into the center? That was the first. The second thing that I wanted to do was sort of pull at the boundaries of what makes up Indian intellectual history. So there's endless written about Gandhi and Nehru and Bose and Bankim Chandra and so on, and not that much written about those figures who disagreed with them, whether that's K.M. Munshi or Madan Mohan Malviya or any number of people. And so that's why I went to Savarkar. And then the third thing was that as I began working on Savarkar, I discovered to my immense dismay that just about everybody writes about him. Everybody writes about him. Retired IT professionals in Silicon Valley wrote about him. Retired computer scientists, journalists, scholars. And then discovered, to my delight, that almost everybody who writes about Savarkar in English doesn't read him in Marathi. And so the archive for me was actually his Marathi writings. And then the archive for me became, as it does, I think, for most historians, a kind of serendipitous archive. Mm-hmm. It became the prefaces of the Marathi works that were written about him. It became works that were written about him in other Marathi journals and newspapers. So I didn't have to go through a purity test. I had to actually figure out how to create an archive, to write about somebody who'd been immensely written about and was immensely controversial.
But were all of his letters in the public domain? I mean, sure, okay, you can get into archives, you can look at prefaces. You can even look at the London, London archives. He spent some time in London and he very much came to the attention of the authorities. I've waded through some of the Secret Service documents about, there is this guy, we've got to keep an eye on him.
I was very lucky to get the police file on him. And I got the police file on him, and I got the police file on a few other revolutionaries. And those police files are extraordinary documents because they're all intertextual. So every police file on any single revolutionary gives you the archival number of all of the other revolutionaries he's in touch with. You can't always find them, right? Because the police are notorious.
Well, they hide things under
they
different folios.
They do.
Yeah.
And so a lot of what Savarkar wrote, he and his family destroyed because they were under police surveillance.
Right.
And so you had to get it from, or I had to get it from other sources, prefaces, people who'd seen him once, people who'd met him once, and do a little bit of digging because he wrote in many, many pseudonyms. There were a number of pieces of his which were unpublished. And then, they were unpublished when he wrote them, and then they get published after his death.
Okay. Civil servants, we've already established that when in their existence, when they're doing the job, they have to be in the background. They exist to let others shine in front of them. But your character is kind of the Where's Wally of history, because he's there at such a pivotal moment.
Yeah.
Did you find him appearing in some really important, well-known diaries, letters of those household names who've been written about to death? And did he himself keep a naughty diary? Because sometimes civil servants did that. They wouldn't talk in public about how insufferable they thought people were around them, but they would keep quite waspish diaries and letters about this.
You know, I wish he had. It would have made my job so much easier. But what actually helped me was the fact that, so VP Menon was our last reforms commissioner before we became independent. He was also Sardar Patel's right-hand man when it came to the integration of the princely states. His immediate boss was a guy called Harry Hodgson. Harry Hodgson was much younger, but they became the best of friends. And when Harry Hodgson was researching his own book on his time in India, he came out to India before VP Menon died in the 1960s, sat down with him and interviewed him. And 18 hours worth of interviews are in the SOAS archives. And when I discovered that, it changed everything. So full disclosure, I am his great-granddaughter. So this changed my writing of this, and it was a personal and professional moment of great joy, right? I could listen to him. He talked without reserve, right? This was some 20 years after he had retired. And he talked without reserve about the full swathe of the independence movement. He talked about the people he had seen. He talked about being in rooms where there were arguments. It was the actual...
But he wasn't bitchy, and bitchy is quite exciting.
He was, I wish he was bitchy. He was angry about a lot of things, and I allowed that anger to become one of the primary voices in the writing of this biography. Because when you're listening to someone talking about being in the room when certain important decisions were being taken, it changes how you're approaching writing this, right? So that was one. The other part was when you're looking at archival sources per se. Like Robert was saying, sometimes it's the notes in the margins, and sometimes it's the annotations to various things. That's where you find the civil servant actually speaking, more or less, right? If you go back and look at all the transfer power volumes, he's in nearly every dispatch.
He's there.
Just ask Menon this or get Menon's opinion on that, which helped me to understand that, okay, this guy played a far more pivotal role than I had ever dreamed he did, which allowed me to look at the archives with fresh eyes and say, okay, I need to sort of understand how the transfer of power actually took place. The area where I hit a difficulty was his personal life. So VP Menon, his first marriage was an arranged marriage. He had 2 sons by it. And then at some point, when the eldest son was 9, this first wife just vanishes. There's nothing. There's no documentation. There's no photograph. There's nothing, right? He then goes on to marry another person, another woman, and this woman, the second marriage, becomes the definitive Mrs. Menon, Mrs. VP Menon. I couldn't find anything. So that is, actually speaking, my real great-grandmother vanished into thin air. When I questioned descendants of the family, they just closed ranks, would not tell me anything about her. So that became a huge block. I had to address how I wanted to sort of address that in the book, which I have. And I've said that, look, I haven't been able to find anything.
Yeah,
I tried.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, there's no point, it's a juicy story. I mean,
Yeah.
what happened? These kids were traumatized by this woman's disappearance. Why was she expunged from family records? These are unanswered questions in the biography, which...
Well, volume 1 of the biography.
Well,
I mean,
so
people
far.
come forward to
People
things. And people, I mean, you had no bitchiness.
I had no bitchiness.
Then you were doing backstroke and, front crawl in one of the most erudite, and may I say, quite waspish sort of sections of humanity. So when you were talking to people, how could you, as a biographer, sift through and go, you know what, you have an agenda and you're just being unpleasant and not very nice, or you have absolutely got the measure of, in this case, Sontag, but anyone that you write about?
Well, this is one of the real difficulties, because people tell you, we were just in the green room talking about a notoriously waspish is a generous way of describing this person, a person who, at this kind of, Tina's talking about the royal court, but there was a kind of royal court, and if you're talking about a powerful politician, in the case of Stalin, or these other people, there's always an agenda. So it's not that nobody has an agenda. I think you have to assume that everybody has an agenda and then just say, what is the agenda? And then once you assume that, you can say, well, this was an ex-lover. This was a political rival. This was a family member. So those people come into it. And I think that a word that's so hard to define and so hard to understand is taste. It's a very difficult word to pin down. But the more you know about something, it's funny, I'm with a friend who's here in India for the first time. And when you come to India for the first time, there's so much happening. You can't really see it. It takes a while to actually know what's what and where is where and who is who. And it sometimes sort of might take 10 trips to come to India before you start actually seeing something closer to what an Indian would see. And with a biography, you're not only involved in this person's life, you're involved with everything around it. And you do get to know the people, and you get to know who's honest and who isn't, who's desperate to be in the biography. You're talking about people who are long dead, which is a little different. But with Sontag, it's all of New York who are still around, and they're desperate to be in the biography because there's some cultural prestige and there's some sort of fancy points that you get from being involved with this person. And but I think the taste that you evolve from just knowing stuff is very hard to describe, but you do get it at a point, and you think, oh, that person, forget it. That person, though, and often, as Tina was saying, it often is a completely, you're talking about marginalia also, and these little, but it's also people who are sort of marginalia, and those people are good, and some of these people can have all this access and all this knowledge, and they don't tell you anything, and they're dull. And sometimes the woman who, pours you the water at the event has this eagle eye. And those are the people that you look for.
And it will just be, as Tina was saying, one fact that unlocks one treasure trove of stuff that you've heard. With your journalism as well as with your books, have you had people come up to you, Tina, because again, yours are alive still, and people who know them are alive still, coming up and saying, that, what you wrote hurt me, I hated it, and I want you to answer for what you did? I mean, do people ever take it that personally?
In my Vanity Fair diaries, there were people who discovered what I was thinking about them at the time and were upset by it, because sometimes you have sort of very congenial social relationships with somebody, but if you're really asked to take a truth serum and sort of say something, say who you think they really are, isn't necessarily the same thing. And as I was publishing my diaries, I was determined for them to be authentic, you know. So there were some people that I wrote about in a fairly sardonic fashion that they were very upset about it. And
what do you say when someone looks you in the eye and says, you know what, I thought you liked me. I thought you thought I was fabulous.
I mean, in the case of this one person, it was about his father. And I said, look, you know, it's what I felt at the time. You know, I came to feel differently about him later, which was sort of true, as I got to understand it. But I did think he was a complete bloody buffoon, you know, when it came to business. And it was, I didn't quite know what to say about that. It was just a fact, you know. So relations cooled, I would say, after that.
Right.
So it's difficult. But you can't, if you want to be truthful and real, you just simply can't log roll and sort of pretend, you know, otherwise it's dead on the page. It's difficult writing about Elizabeth II because there's so much sort of hagiography and so much dancing sycophancy around her. And what I discovered really, I mean, for me, the way into Elizabeth was she was actually she had a sharp, sort of Mitfordesque, slightly cruel sense of humor, actually. And as soon as I discovered that about her, I really started to like her. I mean, there was a bit of Maggie Smith in there, you know, that I love. I mean, to me, the quintessential great story that I got about the Queen was that the courtiers are all sitting there talking about what she's going to do in the, not the Diamond Jubilee, the Golden Jubilee. And they just built that wheel, you know, that big wheel in London.
The London Eye.
The London Eye.
The London
That's
Eye,
right.
yeah.
And one of the people said, well, ma'am, we thought it might be rather good if, rather interesting and rather amusing, perhaps, if you took a ride on the London Eye. And she looked at him and she said, I'm not a tourist. And that was a sort of quintessential Queen sort of off stage, you know, that she was quite tart. And once you sort of know that about her, she becomes more interesting.
But your writing is great for that. I mean, forgive me if you were at the morning session that Tina did, but I really enjoyed it. And there was this lovely thing that you shared about the daily phone call between the Queen Mother and her Lilibet. And the question, go on, you tell them how the question went. It's so sweet.
Her mother had a great sense of humour too. I mean, the Queen Mother's sense of humour was different. She was very camp in her sense of humour. And whereas Elizabeth was sort of sharp and tart. But so the Queen Mother, you know, in their morning phone call, she would call up and say, have you been being Queen today, Lilibet? How are you being Queen? And they would sort of laugh about it. But they understood that they had these roles and they could do full Queen. I mean, the Queen could just, you know, come out of being, you know, shooting or hunting or whatever with the dogs, whatever, and she could do full Queen if that was what was required. It was simply something she could just slip into and do. She knew how to do it, and she did it better than anybody else. But it wasn't her.
No, but it's also the other thing that I took from it is that she was a good Indian girl and called her mum every day. I mean, I thought that was delightful. I'm going to open it up to the audience in 1 second, but I just want one quick question for you, Bob, if I may. When you have people who are monsters of history, you mentioned Stalin. Do you have to? I mean, I suppose it's the resistance against presenting the cartoon two-dimension that this is a monster. Or do you find yourself fighting against yourself to try and find the humanity? Or how does it come out? Because your characters are very well-rounded. They are complicated.
The big question, I think, for people like Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, and probably the same is true of Hitler and Mussolini, is between those authors who say so much monstrous stuff was done by each of them. They were so evil that anything you say that humanizes them is a disservice to history and to humanity. I think that's a profound mistake. If you fail to humanize, i.e., tell the story of the politician and revolutionary Stalin without mentioning his human qualities, his hobbies, his relationship with his wife, his attitude to animals, then in fact, unless you do that, you let him off the hook. Because if you turn Stalin or Lenin into a robot, into a non-human animal, you're letting him off the hook. You're saying, if we catch this man who's killing millions of people, we can't put him in trial because he's a psychopath, he's a sociopath, he's a psychotic individual. So I think it's very important that people who do bad things in history or in politics are brought to book by us human beings who treat them as human beings and see what the sources of their inhumanity were in the context of their being humans like us.
Yeah. No, I agree. If someone can love their mum, how can they fail to love hundreds of thousands of people that they, you're absolutely right. I'm going to open it up. We've only got a few minutes. We've had a cast of thousands up here, so forgive us that the questions are a bit short. First person I saw was the gentleman with the sunglasses. You know I'm pointing at you. There's a lady here at the front. Can I get the second microphone here so we don't waste any time? Do we have a second mic hold? Yeah, if you can get it to the lady in the front row. Okay, let's take one here. Let's rattle through.
Is any one of you... what would you feel about writing the biography of Donald Trump?
Oh, Tina? Tina? Who lives in New York?
I think he's much more interesting now than he was in 2016, actually. And what I wanted to say to Robert is like the moment when a person pivots into being a monster. Trump Serial 2, as I think of it, season 2, is a much more sort of focused bad person, than he was in season 1. In season 1, a lot of what he did was sort of stumble around and flame out and make it up, and he was sort of chaos, really, in his first term. The tragedy is that he didn't just win the election, actually, the second time, because then he would have gone stumbling around until he'd gone. Unfortunately, in the 4 years that he was in exile, developing greater and greater rage at being sort of punished in courtroom a lot, he developed quite an organized worldview, actually. And second time around, he's much more interesting. So I think that as a biography subject, that's interesting.
Round of applause if you think Tina should just do it. Just do it. Just write it. If anyone can write it, you could do it. Okay, let's take another question. From the lady there. Can I have another hand up here so we won't waste time? There's a lady over there with her hand up. Stand up so they get the mic to you. Okay. Yes.
My question is to Ben. And I'm sure the world of biography does not just ask what can be written, but like who can write it. And you're writing about people who've written on women, quite literally. So how do you approach with rigor the questions about all that is identitarian, specifically with your own gendered experience?
This is something that's fascinating because it's changed so quickly. When I first started writing my first biography of Clarice in 2005, 2004, first of all, men never wrote biographies of women, so this was thought of as wonderful. And everybody said, oh, it's so great that you're doing this, nobody does this, isn't that lovely? 10 years later, the whole world had changed, and it was how dare you exploit this poor lady's life, Susan Sontag, this sad victim of a person, and it's very funny. I write it exactly the same way as I would write it. I think that if I wrote about an Indian, for example, I'm not Indian. So does that mean I can't ever write about India or Indians? Does it mean I can't write about people who have a different religion or a different class background or a different education or maybe speak a different language? I write because I'm interested in the person. Being a woman is a part of it. Being an Indian is a part of it. Being, a Hindu is part of it. And I think it's boring to only write about yourself. It means also you can't ever write a novel because those people aren't you. The whole point, I think, of writing and of literature is entering other people's lives, and particularly people who aren't like you and have these very extraordinary, exceptional lives.
Thank you very much. Next question. Stand up when you are so we can all see where you are. And there's a hand that's shot up there in the middle. Hello, on this side. Hello, mic holder. Just go to the gentleman in the middle. He's shot up there. There we go. Get the microphone to him. Yes.
So my question is, when you're writing about a subject, are you able to remove your own personal biases from what you might have found during your research?
Janaki.
Yes, in a nutshell. In fact, certainly when I was writing about Savarkar, the whole point for me, or the whole exercise for me, was how could I take on somebody who was controversial, where there were bound to be things that I was going to read written by him that I was going to either disagree with or find really repellent, and still do justice to a figure that I had picked to write about, not because I liked him or disliked him or agreed with him or disagreed with him, which were absolutely irrelevant, but because he's a foundationally important figure. And so, yes, you can keep that distance. And I took as my model, in some ways, Robert Caro, who wrote a biography of Robert Moser, a very powerful person, and I took the 2-volume biography of Malcolm X that was written by Manning Marable, which took on board the way in which Malcolm X sort of tried to control the way his biography would be written. So the answer is yes, but with a little help from other figures who'd written about controversial figures.
I could do this for ages. No, wait. I've got to apologise to you because I was going to take another question and then this young man here, make yourself known, it's your fault. He did the international symbol of please give me a break because we run over time. So I tell you what, if you do have questions, go buy the books. These lovely people are going to be signing their books and you can ask them in person. I'm so sorry, but he did the tilt, which you can't disobey. So thank you to all of our panel. Please join me in thanking the entire panel. Thank you for being such a wonderful audience.